Okay, so we're starting with a day in court.
Okay, sorry about that.
Me too. Tonight will be a good one.
I'm one of those people that still has the landline.
Okay,
So typically, the call of the list is at 9 o'clock, and that's where all the attorneys go into Judge Murata's courtroom, and they have a call of the list. So they go through all the cases alphabetically, and they decide if they have all the parties there, do they need a second call because they're still looking to gather the attorneys or not. And if there's something going on that causes the date to have to be moved, they decide that during the call of the list. CASA is invited to the call of the list, but generally I don't go in there because it's very crowded and just there's too many people in there for my liking. And I usually just wait outside, and I know who the attorneys are on my particular cases, or if I'm covering a case with somebody else, and I ask them if anything's going on that I need to know about.
I'm sorry, Jim, I missed that. Did you say it was called Call of the List?
call of the
Yes.
list.
Thank
Yes.
you.
It's a call of the list. The thing is that the other judges don't open their courts to that is done, and that's generally around 9:30. So Judge Lowry, Judge Keating, Judge Bolivar, they will wait to sometime after, at the earliest 9:20, but usually 9:30, they will have their call of the list. But they wait because a majority of the attorneys are in with Judge Murata. And at that point, those individual judges will then go through their list because all the judges have their own cases. And again, the same process happens. They decide what cases are ready. And if there's 3 or 4 cases ready, then they say, okay, A, B, C, or whatever, these are the cases that are going to be heard. These cases need a second call because we don't have a gathering of attorneys. And again, if something comes up, an attorney's not available or a parent isn't available and they need to change the date, then usually the attorneys will gather before that and pick another date. When you go into court, we always try to sit to one side or the other all the way so that the family has a place to sit closer to the aisle and closer to the microphone. Usually the judge will ask DCF to give their version of what the status of the case is, followed up depending on the judge. Usually they will then go to the child's attorney and then the parent's attorney. And at that point, they may ask CASA what we think about the status of the children in particular. The judges read our reports. They will often refer to our reports. I think the most important things you need to know about being in court is, one, if CASA is called on to speak, you need to, in your mind, sum up what you think is the most important thing that the judge needs to know in 2 or 3 sentences. You need to be concise. We speak to what is going on with the children. It's not our job to talk about what the parents are doing or what DCF is doing, other than maybe we want DCF to put in something for the child. So we speak about the child. So you need to be concise, and I shouldn't have to tell anybody this, but you need to be honest. And I know we'll probably go over this later, but you need to look professional. No jeans, you need to be professional. You need to dress professional. Your Sunday best is what my generation would call it. So
I would just add, this is Worcester, so we'll have some other folks talk about our other courtrooms too. Obviously they do things differently in different courtrooms, just, and a lot of it has to do with the space that they're in. So,
and so the other thing is, it's not like TV. And I would say that half the time I go there, we just get another date and there's nothing of substance talked about. And in reality, there's too many hearings, and there really shouldn't be as many hearings as there are. But generally speaking, just know that it's not like what you see on TV. It does not work that way.
Jim, could I just mention two things? Number one, just check with your supervisor before you go to court. It's important that your supervisor knows that you plan on being there, especially in Worcester. It's not always easy to find somebody. So if you just show up, it will be hard for you to either find the courtroom that you need to be in or find your supervisor. And your supervisor is the best judge of whether or not you should be at a hearing. We certainly always welcome you, but we don't always think it's the best use of your time, given, as Jim said, oftentimes we're just in front of a judge for a date change, or something that's being done administratively. And so to hang around for a couple hours, to only be in front of the judge for a couple minutes, can oftentimes be the case. So I just let people know that, so their expectations are not any different. And in Worcester, there are anywhere between 2 and 4 judges sitting on a bench at the same time, right? So your supervisor could often have cases in different courtrooms, and you just need to be mindful of that as well. In Fitchburg, Dudley, and Milford, there's only 1 judge and 1 courtroom that's operating, but in Worcester, 5 days a week, right? It could be anywhere between 2 and 4 judges. And the only other thing that I thought about when Jim was talking is you need to stand when you're addressing the court.
Yeah, and don't worry, we'll go over that again. We have a whole etiquette section, but yeah, that's one of the things that's a highlight to remember, definitely. And it'll sink in because you'll see others doing it, but it's an important part of the etiquette too. And then the other, I wonder if Carrie Ann would be willing to talk about Fitchburg, because they do things differently. And I appreciate their process because they just yell out cases. So if you want to talk a little bit about Fitchburg, North County.
Sure. Fitchburg is smaller and more orderly, I guess, because there's 1 courtroom, 1 judge, like was said. It's on the 2nd floor, juvenile, so it won't be as difficult to find your supervisor. But again, let your supervisor know and talk to your supervisor first if it's necessary that you be there for that date. Fitchburg is similar, where there is a call of the list at 9 a.m. Again, the supervisor can go in there and listen to the call of the list. I don't always do that either. They have been printing a list outside the courtroom when they're done about listing the times each case will be heard. So I either, like Jim does, I either talk to the attorneys and ask them, what's the plan for the case today, or refer to the list. So from there, it's about 9:30 when they get started calling cases into the courtroom one at a time. The court officer there does come out and call the name of the case. So, you can sit in the hallway in the meantime. Make sure to wear your badge, and you should have that on at all times. Yeah, and then they will call you in. In Fitchburg, there's, I think, 2 rows of benches in the back of the courtroom. So typically you would sit in, the first row in back of the attorneys. And it's very similar to the procedure Jim stated. The clerk will call the case, and the judge will ask DCF what the current status is. The DCF attorney will speak. Mother and father's attorneys will speak. Oftentimes the parents are there in the courtroom as well, and they'll sit on that back bench as well as social workers. And the attorneys will speak about what the current status is. Then they'll decide on the next date or anything that needs to be decided at that date.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to add about Fitchburg, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Karen, if it's really an issue. When we first went back in person, Jose, the court officer, made a big speech about it's important to know in that particular courtroom that the judge can hear all the way back to the back rows if anybody's conferencing. And they're very strict about that at that particular court, about conferencing and people talking. And I was in Worcester yesterday and someone was asked to leave because they were conferencing their microphone. So there's really little or no talking. So we just take notes, and we have a notepad if we have to, and it's really quiet, but I wasn't aware of that, but he was very clear about the acoustics in Fitchburg specifically.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In any courtroom, you shouldn't be conferencing or chatting, I should say. If you have a question about a case, again, like use your notebook and discreetly ask your supervisor, or point something out if, you know, you're unsure of what to do. But yeah, there's no talking, conferencing, anything like that inside the courtroom. And after the case is done, everybody leaves. We're not gonna talk to anybody on the case in the courtroom. They'll ask you to leave. The court officer will tell you to leave if you're doing that anyways. But yeah, so you exit the courtroom right after the case is done. Any conferencing can be done, you know, done out in the hallway.
Yeah, that,
You'll oftentimes see parents on your case out in the hallway. They're sometimes conferencing in Fitchburg. They're sometimes conferencing with their attorneys out in the hallway. There's hardly any room or private space for them to actually talk to their clients there.
mhm.
So you'll see that a lot. Again, you know, you can touch base with the parents there briefly while in the hallway, but not in the courtroom.
Thank you. Yeah, I was hoping Chrissy or Carleen, you've been to Milford. Would you just touch base on Milford? Because I haven't been yet since it reopened.
Chrissy, do you want me to jump in?
Yeah, I only went that one time with you, so
Short and sweet, was it?
So,
yeah.
yeah, funny enough, we both attended together the first week that court reopened. And as many of you know, as they're transitioning back from fully virtual to slightly in person to fully in person, there are some glitches. And one of which was CASA supervisors were not always allowed into the courtroom for the call of the list. And if you're not in there for that specific point in time, sometimes you can miss the cases that you're supposed to be listening to. Maybe they just got a new date. They did an informal update with the judge and got a time, whatever it might be. So Chrissy and I went, and it's similar-ish to Fitchburg. I would say there's one courtroom, so it's smaller than Worcester, but you have to go downstairs to check in, and then you'll go back up, you'll wait for your case to be heard. The supervisors should be able to sit in for the call of the list if they want to, and then they can call you in when it is our chance to be heard for our case. But we didn't actually get to go into the courtroom that day. So as for what Judge Lowry is like in Milford, not 100% positive, but I mean, she's also a judge in Worcester on certain days. So I'm sure some people can speak to what her courtroom is like and her expectations and such. So one of the things that your supervisor is likely very good at is finding the DCF attorney or other attorneys that they have relationships with on the case and seeking them out and just asking specific questions. So that's what Chrissy and I did that day. We found the DCF attorney on the case and just went up, introduced ourselves, and got a little case update from him, and then we left.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So Dudley's next, Theodette. I've been to Dudley, Carrie Ann's, but there's a few of us that are regulars at Dudley. So, but I know Theodette.
Thank you, Gloria.
Sure,
I
thank
have been
you.
Dudley just once. I don't have a lot of experience there, but Dudley is a small courtroom. Once I get there, I went downstairs with my docket number, and then they check in with me. They give me the ticket, and then I went back downstairs in the waiting room.
Upstairs, yeah.
Sometimes they can call your ticket number, and sometimes they don't. We have to be careful and reach out to attorney, connect with the attorney, and know what time our case will be heard. Also, I want to mention that during the hearing, after the judge asks all attorneys, the judge can ask CASA if CASA have something to say or not. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah, Dudley is small, it's crowded. The ticket that she's referring to, they give a case number, like number 9, and nothing's in order. They don't call it numerically in order, but the times I've been, they'll just either use that number or they'll use the last name. It's not consistent. But it's crowded enough that you're bumper to bumper with attorneys and folks, because they have two courtrooms there. Number one is for the adults and number two is for juvenile, and it's very crowded. So in the nice weather, people will spill out on the outside just for air. But then that is Judge McNulty. She goes between there and Fitchburg. So that's that, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about, understanding that your case might just get a continued date, the expectations going in, the hard work that all of you put into those reports with the hopes that it's going to push the needle the way it needs to go. And so often it does, but there are legal processes of cases, and dealing with the different outcomes of cases is something we need to prepare you for. And I was hoping Lynn might divulge into that a little bit.
Sure. I think typically during the life of a case, right, there's the 72-hour hearing, which we are not part of. That's often where we are assigned. And then subsequent to that is what's called a pretrial conference. There could be, depending upon how long your case lasts, there could be 3 pretrial conferences, or there could be 30, right? And essentially, the best way to remember what that is it's a status update. It's to provide the judge with information as to how the case is going. Typically, it's DCF reporting on whether or not parents are cooperating with their action plan, or if there's a reunification plan in place, when that might be taking place. A DCF attorney will also speak to the judge about whether or not there's a goal change, and what that might look like or the reasons behind it. Oftentimes, mom or dad's attorney will speak to their version of whether or not mom and dad are cooperating with the tasks on their action plan. Sometimes attorneys will be arguing for more visitation. It could be any multitude of things, right? But unless you're there for a trial, most of our cases, the outcome at the end of the day is the next date for another pretrial hearing or pretrial conference. There is sometimes cases are on for a motion. Typically, those are brought by, I will say typically they're brought by one of the parents' attorneys, sometimes child's attorney, and it is for a specific reason. Maybe their DCF is only providing once a month visitation. The goal is reunification, and judges feel, or the parents' attorney feel like there should be increased visitation, so they'll bring that in front of a judge. And a judge could order increased visitation. It remains to be seen how DCF cooperates with that order. But an attorney would just bring it back. But typically, like I said, unless it's a trial, the outcome will be the next date, or really, I think the only other option is a dismissal, in which a child's been reunified, a significant enough period of time has elapsed so that everyone feels comfortable with the return home of the children. There are no further expressed safety concerns, and a judge would dismiss the case. I'm trying to think of any other outcomes. Anybody else could feel free to jump in, because I feel like I'm missing something.
There's a lot of different outcomes.
Yeah. I mean, some
in
of the
general,
things that we know that are happening that we might want to not have you come, is like the motions for medication or things like that. It's like, why would we be there, for something that's just a process component?
I will say there are a lot of hearings that are just the legal process, and you'll hear nothing about the family being discussed.
That's a good way to put
Sometimes
it.
we have a sense of that ahead of time, which is where it's important to talk to your supervisor. I'd hate for anybody to waste, most of their day and then to hear they're just going to talk about, publication and have the parents been served and, you know, just legal matters that we're not a part of. But
Changing
they're
of
part
attorney,
they're
like
part of
Glenn
the court
said, yeah.
process.
Right.
Yeah,
Or the
yeah, so
birth
there is a lot of that
certificate
as well.
file.
And
Yeah.
there are a lot of hearings you may come to that the judge may not necessarily call on us at all. That's okay too. They'll often acknowledge that they have your report, even if, you know, and they've sometimes looked through the report, and if it kind of goes along with what everybody else has already said, they may not call on you to say anything further. But just know that they have your report. It's now in the case file. So we're not always called on to talk, but you know, if we are, like Jim pointed out before, it's important to be concise and know the points you want to make beforehand and talk to your supervisor about those.
And sometimes they've covered it, the attorney's been great, and it's just, CASA, you have anything to add? And you say nothing beyond what's already been said, Your Honor, thank you, you know, and that's an acknowledgement that we're there.
Yeah, I think the most interesting hearing you will have in the middle of a case, not talking about a termination trial, is a permanency, when somebody objects to the permanency. So the goal gets changed from reunification to adoption. And sometimes the parents' attorneys just object on the record, and that's fine. And sometimes they, for better or worse, they dig in and they want to have a hearing. And so now a hearing is scheduled, and those are basically a small trial. And I've seen it go both ways, but I have seen it where it's damaged the case when it went to the trial because of the findings of that, because you get into everything. So to me, that's probably the most interesting hearing in the normal process of things that we would be able to attend. But a lot of the hearings are vanilla.
Good way to put it. Yeah.
Well, and keep in mind too, right, that if you remember from training, judges have a lot of power in the beginning of a case and at the end of a case. They don't have a lot of power in the middle of a case, except if there's a motion filed, right? So if you're at a pretrial conference hearing and somebody brings up visitation or lack of visitation, or the social worker did this, or DCF did that, the judge really doesn't have any power to make orders under those circumstances. However, if you are at a hearing that has been declared a motioned hearing, that means that an attorney is bringing something forward for a judge to decide. Hearings primarily revolve around what parents are or are not doing. And sometimes it feels like nobody is taking what's happening with the kids into consideration. We don't have to wait to be called on if we have something to say, but that's also a conversation that you need to have with your supervisor ahead of time, that you want to make sure the judge knows this particular thing, right? You know, maybe a child's lost 10 pounds in the last month and a half. Maybe, you know, they've deteriorated, their mental health has deteriorated significantly, but they're still on a waiting list. While those things would certainly be included in our report, you and your supervisor may decide that that's something that you want the judge to know face to face. And, you know, again, what we'll do in that situation is if the judge hasn't called on us, either typically it would be your supervisor that would stand and say, Your Honor, can CASA be heard? And then very succinctly, we would explain what our concerns are. The courtroom can be very adversarial, and I would encourage none of you to take the following statement personally, that the CASA report is full of lies. There are lots of attorneys that will use that as a distraction from the fact that their clients are not doing what they're supposed to be doing on their action plan. And, you know, what I repeatedly tell people in training, not so much in front of a judge, but there may be lies in the CASA report, but they're not our lies, right? That's what's been reported to us. We're reporting that to the court. If we know something to be untruthful, we would certainly indicate that within the report, but there are often times that people lie to us. And if you're in the courtroom, you'll see that people often lie to their attorneys because attorneys will stand up and say things that you know to be untrue. And once again, an attorney's not lying, they're just reporting what their client told to them. And there are some situations in which we might bring to the judge's attention that although mother's attorney said she's been going to individual counseling, perhaps you spoke to the counselor last week and said mom has missed 7 out of the last 10 appointments. We would bring that to the court's attention. We don't stand up and speak to repeat things that somebody's already said. We are, again, mindful that we're reporting on what's happening with the children and in rare cases, parents. But sometimes it feels like the CASA report or you might be being attacked. But I can tell you that attorneys, once they leave the courtroom, don't give that another thought.
Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else any of our staff have anything to add about outcomes that?
I'm still new in learning the court as well, but I have been going a lot. And something that even is hard for me to do, because Lynn said, you know, you'll hear an attorney stand up and say something that you know is not true. As much as you want to say something, you kind of have to keep your cool until asked upon by the judge, or if the judge says, does CASA have anything to add? And you can say, you know, and Jim put it really well one day to me as I was in court with him, is sometimes you are the bearer of something that people don't want to hear, but we're there for the child. And that's all that really matters. Unfortunately, you know, you might say, oh, I don't want to say this in front of everybody, but you know, but you gotta.
Yeah. And, you know, they're invested in different ways, the attorneys,
Right.
DCF.
Right. And sometimes you have to practice, right? It's not easy to
I
stand up
do all
in
the
court.
time.
It's not. But if you really do have something to say, and even to Chrissy's point, like you're not always going to know what somebody's going to say in the courtroom to anticipate it, right? But it isn't like on television, you know, where you're like, that's a lie, right? Like we don't stand up and say that. Again, we wait till it's our turn, and you know, we would say something like, we just want to bring to the court's attention that we did speak to the therapist last week, and that's not the information the therapist gave us. We, you know, we'll certainly try and verify what attorney so-and-so has stated to the court. But, you know, as of this moment, it's our understanding that mother is not participating in counseling, or, you know, whatever it is that, you know, to be untrue. We always try and be composed. We try and just represent facts to the court, and try and keep any sort of emotion out of it. You know, sometimes they'll say parents are regularly visiting a child, and you know that they've missed the last 4 visits. You know, again, you would just stand up and say, the information that we were given by DCF is as follows. Sometimes the DCF attorney won't have that information. Otherwise, they would say the same. But oftentimes you have the most up-to-date information as to what's occurred.
Thank you.
I would also say that I wouldn't be concerned about like shocking anyone or having anyone be like, that's not true. Or 9 times out of 10, there's someone else who knows the information you're saying. But like was pointed out, parents' attorneys are, you know, they're representing their clients. They're going to say what their clients are telling them or represent them the best way they can. So it doesn't always match what you're saying maybe, but typically what you're getting up and saying is not going to be a shock to every single person in that courtroom or anything outlandish, you know.
Thanks,
And
Carrie.
like Jim said, it's not like television, right? I mean, our parents in between hearings, right, which usually happen about every other month or every 3rd month, typically. Oftentimes they're not having any conversations with their attorneys in the interim. And so the attorneys are learning in the hallway that morning of what parents are doing or not doing. There's not a lot of conversation back and forth between attorneys. They're trying to get an update from their client. it's not my favorite way to practice law, but it is the way that it happens in juvenile court. And the more time you spend in the hallways of court, the more times you'll overhear very personal conversations about what's happening on a case. There aren't enough conference rooms for people to go in and close the door and have a conversation between an attorney and a parent. And so a lot of personal information gets discussed out in the hallway. But that's sometimes why attorneys are telling the court things that are not true, because they've heard that from their client 5 minutes prior to the hearing and have had no time to verify that information themselves.
Thanks, Lynn. So I guess we're going to move on to court etiquette, which we already mentioned a little bit about. Again, always check with your supervisor about going to court. There doesn't need to be an assumption that you should show up, and it's optional. We totally respect and are mindful of your daily lives and your time, and we understand that taking the time out to do that is a significant change in your schedule, and we appreciate it. So we're here, right, willing and able to coordinate it as it comes up. Don't feel bad if you can't go. And there's always probably going to be another opportunity to go. Arrive early. Always bring your badge. The badge gets you in. Again, look presentable. Your appearance is going to affect your credibility. And that's just the lay of the land. That's the way it is. Our appearance affects our credibility. There's going to be, again, I think we touched on interactions with families, attorneys, etc. at court. I wonder if one of our supervisors might kind of elaborate on that. We did a little bit, but if you're working with families, there's a lot of the judges, most of them like to see families working closely with their social workers. They like to see that connection, that they're working on their action plan. They're open to direction from their supervisor to follow their action plan and do the work they need to do to reunify with their children. Those may be families that you connect with. Some you may not want to connect with in the hallway. So if we have anybody that would like to talk about that interaction, if we should be talking to attorneys, that's something you're doing with your supervisor. We have to be mindful of our conversations in any part of the court. Jim's going for it.
It depends. I mean, I don't generally have a problem with my advocates talking to the child's attorney. And there are times that we may want to talk to a parent, and then I encourage them to reach out to the parent's attorney and see if they can set up a meeting with their client. The only thing is, it may be one thing to exchange information with the child's attorney pertinent to their client, but it's generally not advisable to exchange any information with a parent's attorney. But all the circumstances are different, and all I can say is ask us, because in different situations, the answer is going to be different.
Thank you.
I would say too that I think too, some of what Glorianne was getting at is who you're sitting with, while you're waiting for the hearing, or who you're talking to, right? I will say that doesn't seem to be as much of an issue in Worcester as it is in some of the smaller outlying courts, right? Worcester, there's a lot of standing around. There's a lot of people mingling with each other. And I don't think it's as obvious as when you're sitting in or standing on the second floor of the Fitchburg courtroom and you're sitting down either with a social worker for a half an hour or a parent for a half an hour. We have had attorneys say to us over the years, essentially it's not a good look, right? You're supposed to be unbiased, you're supposed to be, an independent investigator. And while the discussion you may be having could be about your tomatoes, a lot of it is perception, right? And how somebody else might be viewing, if it's a parent that's particularly upset about, the goal is adoption, and they see you sitting there, for 30 minutes or 35 minutes waiting, to get into the courtroom, laughing and joking with a social worker, their perception may be is that that's whose side you're on. And while I'm not suggesting that you sit there, by yourself, right? You just have to be mindful of who's around you and what's happening.
Thank you. Yep. Well said.
I would say typically you'll sit with your supervisor
Right.
Yeah.
anyways, and then ask your supervisor, you know.
And you're probably going to be going over something that you might need to say, if at all, you know, or who's, you know, and your supervisor can speak. You don't, you're not on the spot. Sometimes it's better if you do, because you're so close to the case, and we'll encourage that. But, you know, you generally will be going over what's going to happen and what we may or may not hear regarding the case going into the courtroom. So that was the last part of what we wanted to talk about, of being in the courtroom. Unless anybody else has anything to add, we're going to save room for questions. But the fun part is we wanted to touch on is the swearing in ceremony. And I still brag about, I was lucky enough, I started an advocate in 2017, and I did attend the swearing in ceremony at the courthouse. And there was CASA put on a little reception, and it was awesome. It just brings home the importance, the integrity of what we do. It just brings it home, having that final ceremony set in, that this is real work, real advocacy in the court system when you go and you get sworn in. So what we're looking about, and I think Lynn can follow up on this, is volunteers who were trained during COVID until now will be sworn in at some point to be announced. And moving forward, our swearing in ceremonies will be in person. So I don't know, Lynn, do you have an update? That would be great.
I think what we discussed with Judge Keating when we met with her a couple weeks ago was we have a training, I want to say sometime in July, and that we would try and do our first live in-person swearing in ceremony since 2019 at that time. And we would invite anyone that trained during COVID to participate in that swearing in ceremony. We also talked about the fact that if people couldn't make it, that the judges would also agree to do a virtual swearing in ceremony, again, for those people that couldn't attend and or, you know, were trained during COVID. But it is a really nice ceremony. It doesn't last all that long. We encourage you to bring your families. The judge that presides over it typically is really great about having photographs taken. And the judges really do appreciate what we contribute to the cases. You know, we provide them with valuable information that they would not otherwise have. And I think any of the supervisors that have been in court have likely heard judges say thank you to CASA after we've spoken on a case. They really understand the time commitment that you put in for training, as well as the even bigger time commitment you put in when you agreed to take on a case. And I think sometimes it feels like maybe we get lost in the shuffle of the legal piece of this, but not with the judges. They're very mindful, and really the attorneys as well. They're very mindful of what you provide for children and for the court.
Can I add that, Lynn, so the attorneys on the cases, they're only required to visit quarterly or monthly?
Quarterly.
Yeah.
So children's attorneys are only required to visit them in person quarterly, so 4 times a year.
Who's seeing them the most besides the social workers? CASA.
Well,
Right.
and even social workers, right? I mean, you'll find in some cases, I mean, and it's case dependent, right? But
Sure.
sometimes the only time social workers see kids is when they pick them up to transport them to a visit. And although, you know, again, because
That's once a
lot of
month,
their parents
at
will
least.
complain. Sorry.
Mhm.
That's at least once a month, and most of the visits are twice a month. I just wanted to interject that I overheard 2 attorneys talking, and the DCF attorney was saying how she got beat up because they hadn't laid eyes on the child in a year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
So that's even recent things about
Yep.
just so You know,
It-
if
it's-
there's anything that I think is the most important thing that you do as an advocate is visit the child once a month.
Right.
That in person is,
Yeah, or more. I mean, some
Crucial.
cases you visit maybe every 3 weeks or whatever, depends on the case. But that's the most important thing that we do.
yeah, you see them in the school setting sometimes. That's
Yep.
highly valuable. So I guess I would like to open it up to some Q&A. Anyone who has a question, feel free to jump right in. We'd love to hear. We covered it all? Really?
I was wondering,
Allison.
as far as, hi, I'm Allison. As far as if a motion is going to be happening, is there any advance notice in a hearing if a motion will be brought forward, or is it just kind of on the spot?
A very, very, very good question.
Very good question. So attorneys are required to give 10 days notice to the court. The unfortunate thing about motions is we are not always informed that a case is coming into court. If, we'll know at a regular hearing, they'll set the next date. But oftentimes, unless an attorney reaches out to us, the court doesn't have a method at this point, seemingly, to know what cases a CASA is assigned to and what they are not. And so it doesn't happen, Allison, like in the moment. The hearing will be scheduled ahead of time, but sometimes we're not aware of it.
They're
Would the
never a
child's
surprise. They have to
attorney?
mark them up.
Okay.
They have to
Okay.
mark
Would
them
the
up.
child's attorney know if a motion,
All the attorneys would
Was-
know.
all the attorneys? So if I kept,
Yeah.
if I reached
If you
out to the
keep in
child's
touch with
attorney?
the child's attorney, you can always say to them right at the outset of a case, we don't always get notified of a motion. I mean, our supervisors do the same. Some attorneys are great about letting us know, and others, I don't think it's purposeful for the most part. I think they just forget, right? And
Huge
so,
caseloads, yeah.
but it is best to continue to remind people, that if there's a motion, could they please just let you know the date? Because we don't always get informed by the court. We did during
Okay.
COVID because we received the docket sheets every week, but they don't create those anymore since in-person hearings have started again.
And my other question was just to clarify that our CASA reports do get shared with all attorneys involved. Is that correct? And is that I know when it was in person, it was normally the day of, but does that happen prior via email to the court date? Okay.
Yes. So during COVID, we adopted a policy, right, in which we sent our report to the court. I think it varies a little bit, but at the very least, at least 24 hours in advance, as well as to the attorneys. Now are emailed a copy of our report. The only person that we can't share our report with that seems a little bit unusual is the DCF social worker. So the DCF attorney gets a copy of our report, and it is up to the DCF attorney as to whether or not they share it with their social worker. And I could tell you, although, my time in court has been very limited in the last number of years, but there have been times when a court report has been shared with a social worker by CASA, and a DCF attorney is very upset about that because for whatever their reasons are, they didn't want the social worker to see that report. Seems kind of crazy, but it's only to parties to the case, right? Which are the attorneys for the child, parents, and the DCF attorney, and as well as the judge. We can't make other copies of our report. And those are the only people it can be distributed to.
Thank
Attorneys
you.
are not supposed to give it to the parents either, but oftentimes they do.
So can I just clarify that we should not be sending a copy of our report to the DCF workers? Is that true?
That's
That
correct.
is true. That's correct. Thank you for clarifying that. Thank you. Erin, did you have a question?
I was going to say, it depends on the
Yeah.
attorney too,
Oh,
because
sorry.
some attorneys do, DCF attorneys do give them to their social workers and some don't.
Thank you, Jim.
Just a quick one. A couple of the case managers mentioned that if you're in court and the times aren't posted or they're not calling out names to ask the attorney, is that referring to the DCF attorney or the child's attorney? Which is the best go-to attorney to speak to if you have a question about logistics?
The one you know the
Your
best.
supervisor, yeah, your supervisor would be able to identify.
We'll do
them
that.
within
We'll
your-
wrangle that, we'll take you with us maybe just to introduce you, but yeah, it's whoever we can grab. And it's discerning if we don't see all of them there, because that means one of them might not be there and then the case can't be heard without representation. And so, yes, good question. Thank you. Peg, did you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Gloria.
Thank
And I
you.
have a quick question. If you have a case that's going to trial, because I do actually right now, and it's only my second case that I've had in CASA, and it's DCF is saying that the children should be adopted, but the parents don't want that to happen. What's the outcome of the trial? The judge makes a determination, and like if they say, oh, the kids go back to the parents, is there a process in place for that to occur and CASA would still be involved in that? I just don't know what to prepare for here.
Very good.
Mm.
Go, Jim.
So depending on who wins the hearing, what the judge decides, yes, the rights are terminated, or no, the department didn't prove their case and the children are being returned. Depending on the circumstances, our involvement is done when the trial is done. However, there are times when a trial results in legal orphans where the parents' rights are terminated, but the children are not in a pre-adoptive home. They're not in an adoptive placement. And those cases we stay in. So I have a couple cases that are post-termination. There's no parent, they don't have any rights, and we're still on because basically the children are in limbo. But if the children get returned to the parents, the department may appeal. And if that happens, if there's an appeal, then for all practical purposes, nothing really changes for us. We keep visiting.
Okay.
Because the case is in legal limbo. So I don't know if that helps.
And if DCF appeals, do the kids go back to their parents or do they stay in where they're
No, they stay where they are.
Okay. All right. That's very helpful. Thank you.
It is. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah, I just want to
Brenda?
add one thing, and
Sure.
again, supervisors can probably say otherwise, but 9 times out of 10, when a case is in trial, if the children are not adopted, I don't know that I've ever seen an outcome at the end of a trial in which a judge essentially says, DCF, you did not provide enough evidence. The children are going home today, end of case, right? A lot of times what you will see happen in a case in which a judge feels like DCF does not have enough evidence to terminate parental rights is a judge will suspend the trial. And as Jim said, the children will remain where they are and CASA would also remain involved, at which point there would be a further trial down the road. There's not a lot of those cases. Most cases that go to trial, I would say, end up with an outcome of adoption or a guardianship, but the reunification cases are a little bit more difficult. They're not, it's not as cut and dried as reunification or adoption, right? It's either adoption or some other form of the case remaining open.
And we have been appointed to cases that we weren't a part of previously, to the scenario that Lynn was just talking about, where we got appointed out of the trial to now go, and basically the court's looking really for CASA to help the court make up its mind whether to reunify, whether the unification is wise or not.
So I don't know if we mentioned this, and Lynn, you might have that makes me think of the 72-hour process, or when they're returned home within that 72 hours. Could you just touch on that for
Sure.
us?
I mean, it's essentially the biological family is being used as a foster placement is probably the most simplistic way to look at it. So there could be a variety of reasons why children are returned home at the 72-hour hearing, but it is almost never because a judge feels like DCF was wrong in removing the children. Sometimes it depends upon the age of a child, especially if it's an infant. It depends upon why DCF removed. But essentially, DCF still has legal custody of that child. They are just placed back home with the parents or the mother or the father in that particular situation. Custody is not returned to the parents. It is just the child is placed back in their home. And that's a distinct difference, if that makes sense.
And then with that, don't they automatically get a CASA?
They
Is that
do.
when yeah.
That
so
is correct.
They
The
automatically
court
get
is
assigned.
required, yes, that's a good point, Gloria, and sorry, thanks for bringing that up. The court is now required in situations in which they return a child home after the 72-hour hearing to appoint a CASA.
And I just learned that because I was like, why are they back home? And why are we involved in back home? Because they're in custody and they automatically get that CASA to go in.
And judges
the
are
home.
aware of the fact that there are limited foster homes. And so sometimes they will make that decision as well. If they don't feel like what occurred to have the children removed is terribly egregious, I guess, right? I mean, I don't know how to say that in a different way, but you know, sometimes it's neglect versus abuse, right? So in a neglect case, they might be more likely, you know, to return a child to their parents for placement purposes, as opposed to, you know, trying to find a foster home.
Yeah. And then they'll get some services to
Right.
help them get back on track.
Yes.
And we'll be there to monitor.
Right. The case remains the same as how it unfolds. But you know, the children are living at home.
I want to be
Believe it or not, I
mindful.
once had a case years ago in which a child was placed with her mother and DCF changed the goal to adoption.
Oh, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow.
Um,
I have
again,
another question. Can parents, oh, I'm sorry, did I talk over somebody that was
No.
starting?
We're happy. I'm mindful that people need to leave and we appreciate that you were here, but we're here. We can take more questions, of course.
Can parents' rights be terminated? Like there's two parents, okay, mother and father, but they're not together. And mother's like completely out of the picture, hasn't done anything. She's kind of missing in action, actually. Can her rights be terminated without a trial? But father still were going through the process. No. So
No,
Well-
they may do what's called a prima facie
Prima facie.
and
okay.
terminate her rights, but there's got to be a legal action because absent that, at least in this state, the rights to the children custody reverts back to mother, not father. So they would either have to terminate the mother's rights or have a probate agreement that gave custody to the father.
Okay.
So sometimes you'll have a case, right, in which the child was removed from the mother and then she disappears, right? So as Jim said, they would have a prima facie case in which you are terminating mother's rights when she's not present. She has 30 days to appeal, but father then has to go to probate court and get underlying custody because he didn't have it prior to the children being removed.
Okay. Yeah.
So there's a lot of legal
child's
steps.
Currently, there's no attempt to, reunify with dad. Child's currently in a pre-adoptive home, but I was just curious.
A lot of legal boxes to be checked.
Yeah.
It just seems crazy to keep trying to track down mom and that DCF has to continue to try to follow mom when mom has not participated in anything.
Right. I agree with that statement.
Yeah.
It happens. I had the first day of trial, a father walked into court looking for a lawyer and nobody had heard from him for 3.5 years. So strange.
Is that the one I went to, or is that a different
Yes.
one? That was entertaining to the judge and everybody. They were like, he was like, fair enough. Well, he had a restraining order against him, so he wasn't allowed to participate. And the reason why he found out about the hearing was through his sister, and he showed up, and Judge Bob was like, fair enough. New date set though, because he needed representation. He needed an attorney, but that was something. So I'm so grateful that everyone could make it today. If you think of any questions at all, email any of us or your supervisor. We're all here to, answer questions and possibly coordinate your first day in court. Or Nancy's been, Nancy was thrown in pretty quick, cold feet. She did great. So if you do go, it's a privilege and it'll be a learning experience. If you don't, we totally appreciate your time and of course the work you do with the kids, boots on the ground. So thank you all for coming, and we look forward
Thank
to
you. This
seeing
was
again.
very helpful.
Oh,
This was
thanks,
very helpful.
Francis. So glad to hear
Thank you.
that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Everybody have a great rest of the week. And if you
Thank
want to
you.
hear it
Bye.
again, we'll be back at 5:30. If there's anything you missed.
If you're really bored tonight.
Rinse and repeat, so.